So let me tell you, I'm delighted that you're here today. We have an outstanding panel to lead us in a discussion about the Apostle Paul. I've got a number of questions I'm really excited to ask them about, but first, let me bring them up here and let me introduce them to you. Mark Hamilton, I'm going to start with Mark. Come on up, Mark, grab a seat. Mark Hamilton, professor of Old Testament at Abilene Christian University. Abilene, for those of you who don't know, is a suburb of Lubbock, Texas. It's about 2.5 hours southeast of Lubbock. And we're delighted to have Mark with us. Mark took an undergraduate degree at Freed-Hardeman College, took 2 master's degrees at Abilene Christian, his PhD at Harvard University. He teaches Hebrew, biblical exegesis. He can answer your questions about Job and why Job had so many difficulties in his life. And he teaches Job. He teaches a number of different things like that. And his wife is fluent in Korean. And she is also a biblical professor at Abilene Christian. So you can just really clean up talking to Mark and his delightful wife when this is over with. Mark, thank you for being here today. Would you join me in giving a round of applause to Mark? George Goldman, come on up, George. George is next. Now, George comes from my alma mater, Lipscomb University, and we're delighted to have him here representing the Fighting Bisons of LU. Used to be DLU, but it's just LU. They actually used to be DLC. Shows how old we are. Or maybe not you, but me. Anyway, George teaches Greek. He teaches New Testament, teaches faith and culture, has his bachelor's and undergrad from Lipscomb University, and then his MDiv from Harding University, and his PhD from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, TEDS, outside of Chicago, where library we have like a library member, actually several up at TEDS, and so you would know James Hoffmeyer and John Monson and heavens, we had D.A. Carson speak here in our series and a number of others. So it's a delight to have a TEDS alum here, and we appreciate. Would you join me in giving a round of applause to George Goldman? Next, we have Dr. David Rudolph. David, would you come join us? And David, I'm going to put Joseph Shulam there, so I'm going to put you here, if you don't mind, by me. David Rudolph, a Messianic Jew. David has a fascinating testimony of how a police officer was really responsible for leading his Jewish father and family, ultimately, to Christ. And David has taken that and run with it extremely far. Let me tell you where David's come from. A bachelor's degree in pastoral theology, a master's degree in Messianic Jewish theology, a master's degree in biblical languages, a master's degree in Old Testament, and then just to cap it all off, he went to Cambridge University for 5 years to get a PhD in New Testament. So he's got both ends of the Bible and can meet you in the middle. And we are honored to have Dr. David Rudolph with us. He is the head of Messianic Jewish Studies at King's University, up outside of Dallas, Southlake. That's right. All right, so we're delighted to have him. And then our featured gentleman for the weekend, Dr. Joseph Shulam. Come on up, Dr. Shulam. Okay, get a load of this. 7 languages? How many? Okay. It's 9 languages. 9 languages. And that's not even counting Pig Latin. That would bump it up to 10, I'll bet. And if he doesn't know it, I can teach it to him in 5 minutes. Born in Sofia, Bulgaria, immigrated to Israel in 1948. He was famous for teaching all of the older kids how to smoke in his neighborhood. And never let it be said smoking cannot lead you to Christ, because he got caught with that. And when he got caught teaching some older kids how to smoke, the Christian father of those older kids was none too pleased. And somewhere in the midst of all of that, between that and a high school project, Joseph Shulam came to know the Lord, was ostracized by his family as a result, and came over to the United States to live and to finish high school, and then stayed and studied at Lipscomb University as well. Went back to a rabbinical yeshiva in Jerusalem, studied to be a rabbi. Now, I call him rabbi, even though he is not a rabbi in the Jewish, they wouldn't give him the title rabbi because he was a Messianic Jew. But he did all the qualifications for it, and heavens, we need rabbis in Messianic Judaism too. So Rabbi Shulam, graduate school at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and has been writing and teaching all over the world for decades, leads a Messianic Jewish congregation in Israel. We've worked for over a year to get him here this weekend, and it's a real honor to have him here. Would you join me in welcoming Rabbi Shulam? Okay, gentlemen, here are the rules of the afternoon. We have 2 microphones. One exists between you two, and one exists between you two. We are taping this to put it on the internet. And so we would ask you, when you're speaking into the microphone, both so that the audience can hear and so that the internet can hear, would you be sure to hold the microphone basically where you're swallowing it? Keep it right up against your chin, and we'll be able to hear you. Now, they sent me some questions to talk about with Paul, but I'm prone to go off script and do what I want. Let's start off script. 2 days ago, I was on an airplane. I was flying to Florida. I had to make a presentation. I had a gentleman who's a friend of mine on the plane with me. This gentleman's Jewish, but he's a secular Jew by and large, which means that his parents were Jewish, but and even was bar mitzvahed. But after his bar mitzvah, was basically left without a practicing Judaism. His parents told him there is no God. And so now this gentleman is in his mid to late 50s. And he has started thinking about God a little bit more seriously. He has come down, he's occasionally gone to church. He has had opportunities to hear about God. And he said to me on the airplane, he said, okay, I was watching something on the History Channel. It was about the Bible. And on the History Channel, they talked about this fella being stoned. I think he was the first guy to get killed outside of Jesus. He said, does this ring a bell? I said, yeah, I think that was probably Stephen. He says, yes, that was it. He says, well, there was some Jewish guy who was there part of the persecution of this Stephen. And he said, that Jewish guy, I don't remember his name. I said, well, he had a Roman name, but he also had a Jewish name. His Jewish name would be Saul, and his Roman name would be Paul. He says, yeah, that was him, Saul. He said, did he become a Christian or something? He got blinded. And I said, yeah, he did. And he said, do you know much about that? I said, I'll tell you this. One of the main reasons I believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, is because of the testimony of Paul. And we started the discussion. He said, why? So I'm going to start. Joseph, we're going to start with you. You are the man of the hour. Does Paul help you in your faith believe that Jesus is Messiah, Son of the living God?
You want the truth or politically correct?
I want the truth.
The truth is no,
And tell me why.
because Paul is very, very difficult to understand. And historically, Jewish people had much easier time with Jesus and much harder time with Paul. That's why I've dedicated about 35 years of my life to study Paul. The other thing that I want to say, did Paul ever say that he was a Christian? Did he ever say, I converted to Christianity, I became Protestant or Catholic or Presbyterian? He never did. He always said 5 times, at least in his letters and in the book of Acts, I am a Jew, I am an Israelite, I am a Hebrew, I am from the tribe of Benjamin, I'm a Pharisee of the Pharisees. But he never said he was a Christian.
Okay, so the lawyer in me wants to defend my initial position, but before I do so, I will give someone else up on this platform a chance to do so on my behalf.
Okay.
Anybody find Paul inspirational to their faith other than the lawyer at the end of the table?
Well, I would agree with a lot of that, but I would say Paul was at one time a Pharisee who did not believe in Jesus, who then became a Pharisee who did believe in Jesus. And so in that sense, what helps my faith is why would Paul do that? Why did Paul change? He must have experienced, he must have seen something to make that radical of a change, because it didn't make his life better, didn't do it for the money. So why make that change unless he actually saw something on the Damascus Road?
And that would have been, yes, that's a large part of what I had to say. But that's not to take away from what our rabbi has already said, because I think our rabbi makes some valid points as well. But with due respect, anybody else want to chime in on this subject before I keep the storyline?
Yeah, I'll give the line from Greater Lubbock if I can. That fell flat, didn't it? It died of morning. Part of our discussion maybe this afternoon may end up being, what do you mean by Christian? As Joe says, Paul never calls himself Christianos, though he did live in Antioch where apparently the name was used, right? So that's an interesting puzzle, I think. For me, Paul's important because he helps Gentiles like me think about our story as part of the great story of Israel, as one of the mighty deeds of God, right? The inclusion of the Gentiles is a demonstration of God's mercy to the world in Paul, at least as I understand him. Yeah, he's hard, but we have a lot worse things we could be doing than spending 35 years on Paul. So how about that? Yes, no, and
well, that's
buts.
okay. Now what we need to do is we need to get down to this end of the table to see if this is a true Jew-Gentile distinction at this table, or to see whether or not the Goyim have anything to offer on this point. Talk to us. Tell us your perspective.
Yeah, well, I very much sympathize with what Rabbi Joe shared. For me, Paul is very inspirational for my faith, because not only did he have this education as a Pharisee, as someone who grew up as a Pharisee, but also he experienced amazing suffering because of his faith. He experienced shipwrecks. He experienced lashes. And yet he persevered to the end. And that didn't distance him from his people or from Judaism, but he continued to remain loyal to his people. He continued to remain loyal to the God of Israel, and that's deeply inspirational.
Okay, the concept that I had to my friend was very much along the lines of what you've all said, and in fact, Rabbi, even includes what you said, because Paul did not ever say, I'm no longer a Jew. In fact, when he speaks of being a Pharisee, he speaks of it in the present tense. I am a Pharisee of Pharisees. He doesn't say, I was a Pharisee. And yet, as we've got here, here's a man who's on the fast track. This guy's getting to study with the very best of the best. He's obviously from a family of some to-do. He's got Roman citizenship. He's got Tarsinian citizenship. He's got family. He may or may not have a role on the Sanhedrin. He's got super training from Gamaliel. He's got a relationship with the high priest that enables the high priest to give him these letters. And yet, all of that he counts as rubbish and lets go of in view of the surpassing value of his experiential knowledge of Jesus. And he's willing to count everything else as garbage. So he's either a wingnut, a very deluded man, or he had some type of an encounter and a life that followed that encounter, which left him never in doubt that Jesus Christ was the resurrected Son of God in power. And so it's within that context that I found him, and it's within that context I want to start pushing y'all to answer some questions for me. So let's start with the Pharisees themselves. What's a Pharisee? Rabbi?
All right. First of all, the Pharisees were the first Protestants. Why? Because they brought a major revolution in the 2nd century BC. A very good revolution. Before the Pharisees, if anybody wanted to know what is the will of God for him, he would go to the priest or to the prophet. That's the Old Testament paradigm of finding the will of God. There is no Old Testament paradigm that you read a book and you analyze the text and you discern from the text what is the will of God for you. That was the contribution of the Pharisees, the same as the contribution of Martin Luther to the Protestant world. That the text is available and that the text is not in heaven. The Torah was given down here on earth for people to analyze it. And each one, not a priest or a prophet or a clergy, each individual has the responsibility to study the Torah and from the Torah to discern the will of God. That was the great contribution of the Pharisees. Obviously, hypocrisy doesn't have a monopoly by anybody. Nobody monopolizes hypocrisy. The first one to call the Pharisees hypocrites was King Yanai, Janneus in English, right? Am I saying it right? Janneus, 1st century BC. His wife, her name in Hebrew was Shlom Tzion. In English, I think they call her Princess Mary. I don't... Salamina. Shlom Tzion in Hebrew. She comes to him and complains about the Pharisees. And she says there are 7 kinds of Pharisees. I'm not going to get into it, but if you count the things that Yeshua speaks about in Matthew 23, there are 7 sins of the Pharisees. This Salomina, the wife of Janneus, was the first one to coin these 7. And she says, I'm afraid of the Pharisees because look what they do. They bind commandments on other people that they themselves don't keep and so forth. He says, don't be afraid of those who call themselves Pharisees. Be afraid of those who call themselves Pharisees, but they are hypocrites. Not all the Pharisees were hypocrites. There were some hypocrites and some not. Just like not all the Protestants are hypocrites or the Catholics are hypocrites. There's always some who are and some who are not. So we have a distorted view of the Pharisees. And when Paul says, I'm a Pharisee, he explains it very well. Later on in the book of Acts, what the Pharisees believed. They believed in the supernatural, in the miracles. They believed in angels. They believed in the resurrection. So any Christian that believes in the resurrection from the dead and believes in angels and believes that the Holy Spirit can do miracles, he's a Pharisee. So we're all Pharisees in that sense. The apostles were Pharisees, Jesus was a Pharisee, and Paul was a Pharisee, but they were good Pharisees, and there were some Pharisees who were not so good. So what can we do?
All right. Nicodemus might come to mind as a good Pharisee, at least the way he's treated in John 3. Okay, so we've got the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees come out of a historical movement, maybe movement's the wrong word, a set of historical events at least that are very important to the Jewish people even today. If we go back to the Maccabees and their revolt and all of the genesis of the Hanukkah traditions and things that happened between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, we've got some very strong issues of, can the Greek world bind itself onto Hebrew thought? Can the powers that be, the governmental powers and others, force the Hebrews to modify their religion such that they incorporate Greek thought and Greek religion, which through Alexander the Great had spread throughout the Mediterranean world? The Jews revolted successfully and stopped from having to incorporate Greek thought, Greek practice, we should say, into their religion. Am I fair so far? Or any of y'all want to take issue with my summation of history up to this point? Okay? All right. So now here comes the Apostle Paul. And some might say he does the very thing that the Jews worked so hard to keep from happening. He takes this Jewish religion of Torah and starts bringing in all of these Greeks who pretty soon become, if not the leading arm of the church, at least a deep philosophical foundation for theology. Does Paul actually do such a thing, or is that illusion? Who wants to start? This is a panel discussion, guys. The rabbi will get his word in.
Well, I would say Hellenism had already affected the culture. So I don't see Paul necessarily as adapting Judaism to Hellenism as much as, I don't think that changed because he became a Christian. I think that he was already drawing on things that already were influencing the culture.
Philo
Yes,
of
for example,
Alexandria.
Philo, and I think the scholar's name is Martin Hingel, who showed that there's as much Hellenism in Israel as there is outside of Israel. So the old thought that Paul kind of took a Jewish religion and made it more Gentile or more Greek. He kind of broke that down to say no, it was already influenced even in the land of Israel by Hellenism.
All right.
Well, as George is already taking down this road, in a way, you're talking about an empire of 60 million people. So there are lots of different ways of being Hellenistic, and several 100,000 of those are Jewish. So there are several different ways of being Jewish. So that's the first place to start. The second observation is, if you read Paul's letters, he spends a lot of time indoctrinating Gentile believers in Jewish text. He assumes, you read, the example I like to give is 1 Corinthians 10. I don't want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all baptized to Moses in the sea. They passed through the sea in the cloud. They ate the same spiritual bread. They drank the same spiritual drink because they drank from the rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So you're assuming Gentile readers in Corinth can know the Exodus story, can follow midrashic logic that the rock moves around like it does in pseudo-Philo, and that it makes sense to say the rock in the book of Numbers is Christ. So that's a lot of assumptions in an audience that 2 days earlier were pagans, right? So he really is both. He's moving Judaism to non-Jewish people, and he's working in this larger world.
All right, Dr. Rudolph, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's very interesting that in 1 Corinthians 7 that Paul says, this is my rule in all the congregations. If one is called circumcised, remain circumcised. If one is uncircumcised, remain uncircumcised. And then he says something very interesting in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 18. He says, do not remove the marks of circumcision. And many Pauline scholars see that as an allusion to the Maccabean language, because as you were pointing out, during that period of time, the attempt to Hellenize and to disguise circumcision was prevalent. So here Paul, in his very rule to the congregations, is basically saying, I'm not doing that. The other text that I think is very interesting is in Acts 21, around verse 20-21. Luke tells us that there's this rumor that Paul in the diaspora is teaching all the Jews among the Gentiles to apostatize from Moses. And the purpose of Luke bringing that out is to show that the rumor is actually false. And if you actually look at the whole trajectory of Luke's argument throughout the book, it almost seems like Luke is trying to overcome this very concern that you're raising, that somehow Paul is doing the very thing that Antiochus Epiphanes and the Hellenized Jews who were, during that period, who were moving in that direction, were seeking to accomplish. But Luke is saying, Paul did not teach that, and as evidence of that, he portrays Paul as going into the temple and paying for these Nazarites to demonstrate their faithfulness to the Torah, all to prove that Paul, like the Jerusalem Torah-observant Jews, continued to walk in line with the Torah.
All right, wonderful. Rabbi.
What a wonderfully boring panel.
We have a great leader, Joe.
Because here we are, 2 Jews, 2 Gentiles. We agree with each other on everything that is said. That's really wonderful. The issue of Hellenism, like Hengel said and others have written, it was already very deeply ingrained in the Jewish culture before Jesus was born. There were Hellenists already in leadership. The high priests were all Hellenists. All the Sadducees were very, very Hellenistic. The ruling parties in Jerusalem were Hellenists. They were the rich, they were the better educated, they were the political leaders of the country already before Jesus was born. Paul, I see him with one hand using Hellenism, with the other hand rejecting Hellenism. He is not a proponent who wants to convert Judaism to Hellenism, and at the same time the text that David wrote from 1 Corinthians 17 through 23, he doesn't want to convert the Gentiles and make them Orthodox Jews. So he's kind of swimming in this shark-infested water, and he's trying to keep his Jewish identity and the Jews still the elect people of God, and he's trying to get the Gentiles to get out of the pagan Hellenistic world and accept the Word of God, which was from Genesis to the end, the Hebrew Bible, to the end of Paralipomen, what is it, Divrei Yamim, Chronicles, to the end of Chronicles. That's the only Bible they had. When Paul says all Scripture was given by inspiration, it didn't mean, the New Testament. It didn't exist yet, most of the New Testament that we have today. He meant all scriptures, which means from Genesis on to whatever they have at that time. That's what he's trying to bring to the Gentiles. He's not trying to Judaize the Gentiles, but he's also not trying to paganize the Jews. That's something that, it's important for us to remember.
Okay, so help us understand how this works. The Jewish scriptures have been translated by scholars into Greek. That had been done certainly well before the time of Paul. It seems that there are Greek translations of the Hebrew Old Testament well known throughout the diaspora, throughout the dispersed Hebrews, throughout the Mediterranean world. So Paul comes along and he studies at the feet of Gamaliel in Jerusalem. Is Paul studying his scriptures at that point in Hebrew, in Greek, in both?
And in Aramaic, maybe.
And maybe in Aramaic. And go ahead.
Gamaliel was the chief judge of the Supreme Court of Israel, the head of the Sanhedrin. He wasn't teaching, when Paul says, I was studying under Gamaliel, he wasn't learning macrame. He was learning law. Gamaliel was a judge. He was not only a rabbi, he was a judge of the Supreme Court. He dealt with cases of capital punishment, with cases of every kind of legal case that would come to the Supreme Court of America, came to Gamaliel. So it says that Gamaliel, in one of the Midrashim, it says that Gamaliel, out of 1,000 students, chose one to be his understudy. We're talking not doctorate, postdoctorate. Paul, when he studied with Gamaliel was the Supreme Court judge between the year 16 to 36, 20 years. He was in the seat of the highest judge in the Sanhedrin, in the high court. Those were probably the years that Paul was his student. He studied law. He was a lawyer. And he was not only a lawyer, he was the prosecuting attorney. He was the attorney general of the Sanhedrin in the time when Stephen was tried in this trial and then executed. People think that he was the hot check boy or the coat check boy in some fancy restaurant in Jerusalem, because it said that people gave him the coats. That was the judge, the job of the prosecuting attorney. If you want the reference, it's Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, page 42 and 43. It tells you how they executed people, how the Sanhedrin executed people at that time. They didn't have cell phones, and the place of execution was outside of the wall, outside the city. The courthouse was inside the city. There was a wall. There was no visibility between the courthouse and the place of execution. So in case somebody ran to the court and said, listen, I have new evidence, stay the execution, don't execute. How could they, it would take 15 minutes to get walking there. By that time, the guy would be dead. So how could they stay the execution or give? They had two people that were visible between each other. One could see the other. One was on the wall, the other one was on the edge of where the place of execution was. And they didn't have flashlights. In the daytime, there's no nightly execution according to the Jewish law. The only way they could signal each other was with a coat, swing the coat, yes or no, however they signed. And that's how the Talmud describes how they executed in that time. So Paul was the guy who was holding the coat, the sudaros, was holding the sweater and giving the signal to go ahead to execute or not to execute. And that was the job of the prosecutor of the case. So Paul was a student of Gamaliel, he studied law, he was a lawyer, and he was the chief prosecutor of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem at that time. That's why he felt so guilty and said, I'm the greatest of all the sinners. Because as a lawyer, he broke the law for political reasons, and that guilt is what in the end brought him to the Messiah. And that guilt was, I would say, monopolized by the resurrected Messiah on the road to Damascus. It was a real event. For Paul, it was a real event. He saw the light for real. And that changed his life. He suddenly realized what he has done and what he's doing. And what happened to Paul was the mission to the Gentiles was not something that came as a fact that the Jews rejected him in Iconium or in Derbe or somewhere else. It came because that was the mission of the prophets, all the 8th century prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, Joel, Micah, Habakkuk. All of them had this vision that the day will come in which the Gentiles are going to abandon idolatry and come to the God of Israel and say to one another, let us go up, like in Isaiah 2, let us go up to Zion, to the God of Jacob. For out of Zion will come forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. That the Gentiles say that to each other. It's not the Jews saying it. The Gentiles say to each other that, and Isaiah 62 and Isaiah 66 and Isaiah 56 or 57, all of these chapters and the other prophets, Jeremiah 16, see the day in which the Gentiles are going to abandon idolatry and accept the God of Israel, not convert to Judaism. We don't need Gentile converts. We have our own problems. We don't need your problems. But Paul's vision and mission was get the Gentiles to abandon idolatry and to join the God of Israel without converting, but remaining monotheists and accepting the law and the prophets, which he says that's all I've been teaching, the law and the prophets in Acts 24.
Okay, so natural question. We're going down Old Testament scholar, so pick it up, Mark. You know, he's got his... So if Paul is a lawyer, which, by the way, I find really encouraging and edifying and accurate. If Paul is a lawyer, he has studied the law at the feet of one of the masters of law at the time of his life. He holds and embraces the law, but somehow he's able to distinguish aspects of the law. He has no trouble eating outside of his kosher rules, even though he himself is a Pharisee. He has no trouble, I say that. I'll throw that open because I think some people actually debate that fact, and so I shouldn't assume it. How does Paul juggle Old Testament laws where he attempts to bind some of them on even the Gentiles and others he does not? He clearly doesn't circumcision, bind that on the Gentiles, but he clearly seems to, at least laws of sexuality and things of that nature. He binds those on the Gentiles. Mark, you want to start that one out?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, Paul.
I'm standing in the way.
First of all, we don't know what the curriculum is in the first century, right? I mean, the texts we have are later texts. So Joe cites Sanhedrin and the Talmud, but this is 500 years later. So it is probably true that much of the Talmudic text is, and the traditions are much earlier, but we have to be careful. We don't know what the curriculum is. Having said that, if you read the Old Testament itself, it also makes distinctions among laws, right? It makes distinctions about how how those laws apply to people. Torah applies to Jews. The 613 commandments of the Pentateuch apply to Jews. But some of them also apply to Gentiles, right? Don't murder is not really people-specific. right? Don't commit adultery is not people specific. Somewhere in the period of late Second Temple period or a little bit later, before or after the time of Paul, you start seeing distinctions made in Jewish law about the so-called Noahide laws, the laws that apply to all human beings, simply because they're human beings. And that kind of notion, I think, is part of what's going on in Paul, right? That there are some things that apply to everybody. He also seems to say in Romans that we do in fact keep Torah, right? Now, he doesn't mean that Gentiles are circumcised, and he doesn't mean that Gentiles keep kashrut, and he doesn't mean that Gentiles wear tzitzit and talit, as some of my students do. He doesn't necessarily forbid those things either. He just says these are not things that make you holy if you're a Gentile. So how does Paul distinguish among the laws? I think, as I understand Paul, he really says law is an expression of God's mighty work, and that law is a gift given at Sinai to the Jewish people, but the God who gives the gift is bigger than the law, bigger than the gift given, right? And so Gentiles don't keep that Torah in the same way. I feel like I need a much longer conversation.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Let's
George,
stop
do you
there.
want to jump in here? And then we'll get the Gentile view, and then we'll shift over
That's
here.
right. Well, I want to, as a Gentile, I want to throw out a distinction that I've heard expressed, which I think may be wrong, and get a Jewish perspective on it. I was taught it somewhere along the way, and I've heard it in other contexts, that the difference is you have the ceremonial law, and then you have the moral law. So the ceremonial law are sacrifices and kosher, circumcision. Those things are all not applicable now, but the moral part of the law is applicable. Is that, the problem I see with that is that's nowhere explicit in any text that, okay, here's the ceremonial part and here's the moral part. It's in Calvin, okay. But it's nowhere in the Old Testament divided up, okay, here's moral, here's ceremonial, and it's hard to find any Jewish people who make that distinction. So I'd like to throw that to you and get your response.
Yeah, Dr. Rudolph, you might respond first, and then I'm going to press the question a little more strongly for Rabbi Shulam, unless you want me to press it more strongly first for you. Because, look, I'm the lawyer. I just throw it out there. And I respect what Mark had to say, and I think Mark spoke accurately. But here's the lawyer in me. The lawyer in me says, okay, but in the Gentile world, there was no problem with adultery. In the Gentile world, there was no problem with homosexuality. Homosexuality does not become a crime. I'll speak as a legal historian. In Western civilization, until after the conversion of Constantine, if in fact he was converted, which I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, until after the conversion of Constantine, and homosexual marriage is not outlawed until after that. It's a common practice. Leaving children and abandoning newborn infants because you don't want them is not only legal, it's acceptable. A master is entitled to treat a slave as chattel, as property, and is entitled to kill a slave under certain aspects of Roman law. Now, under Torah, there's a huge difference in those issues. And yet, there are these laws that to us seem a little bit hard to understand. Mixing fabrics, yoking an ox with an ass. It's King James Version. You know, there are some passages that seem to us to be crying out for some Philo of Alexandria allegorical interpretations because they just don't seem to make sense. Where does Paul land on that? There is no way Paul doesn't have this problem staring him in the face when he is evangelizing a Gentile and Jewish world. Talk to us.
All right, so I'll try to make a dent, at least, and then I'll pass it to Rabbi Joe. One thing that is helpful, I think, in this whole discussion is when we look at the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council decision. Because here, the issue comes to the fore. What are the requirements of the Gentile believers, of the Gentile followers of the Messiah? Do they need to be circumcised? Do they need to take on the full yoke of Torah that Jews were expected to take on up until that time, and it seems beyond, according to Luke? And the answer that's given is that there is a distinction, that the Gentiles were exempt from circumcision and from the full yoke of the Torah. And then it goes on to say, toward the end of that chapter, that there are these 4 requirements. And one is sexual immorality, that they cannot participate in sexual immorality, they cannot eat food sacrificed to idols, they cannot eat blood. And so there's an attempt to delineate an answer to this very question. And so the follow-up question then becomes, well, how did they come up with these 4 requirements? And one of the answers that's been given, and that Richard Bauckham has argued very forcefully for, is that the distinction that existed in the Torah between the Ezrachim, the native-born Israelites, and the Gerim, the residents, the permanent residents, but who were not Jews, that the distinctions that existed in ancient Israel, as was pointed out, could be a kind of paradigm for the Messianic community of Jews and Gentiles. So that's one way in which New Testament scholars have attempted to kind of, make some headway in answering that question. Another way, as was pointed out, is to look at these proto-Noahide laws, this understanding that there were some universal ways in which human beings should be treated, which address some of these issues you're talking about. And I would add on top of that if we follow Luke's account, he talks about all these God-fearers in the synagogues. And so the assumption would be that the synagogues had some kind of minchag, some kind of custom that would guide these Gentiles who were coming to the synagogue so that they could know how, as Rabbi Joe was pointing out, how they can move away from the idolatry, move away from these practices that are detestable to the God of Israel, and embrace those practices that please him. So those are some of the ways in which New Testament scholars have attempted to try to answer the question. I just wanted to address one last point, which is that in 1 Corinthians, when Paul addresses the issue of a woman who is a follower of the Messiah, presumably in that context a non-Jewish follower of the Messiah, but who is married to an unbeliever. So, in other words, this is a person who is polytheistic, who's sacrificing to other gods, and they're married and they're living together in the same home. He probably brings food sacrificed to idols home and wants to eat it. Paul does not say, divorce him. Paul's solution is not to very quickly enforce biblical law on the family or on the society. Instead, he says, stay in the marriage unless your husband leaves. And so I think that says something about Paul's whole approach. Paul seemed to have a more long-term approach to this, maybe one by one, trying to ultimately transform the society, which is what actually happened over the course of centuries. And then the last point I was just going to make is I don't think we actually have any example of Paul eating forbidden food, that is prohibited in the Leviticus 11 dietary laws. So even though it's an open question whether he would at times eat pork or shellfish or these sorts of things, at least there's no actual evidence that he did.
Yeah. Yes, Rabbi, I want you to take this, and then I'm going to ask a little bit more of a question from you.
Paul says 5 times in the book of Acts and in his letters, I am a Jew, I'm an Israelite, and in those contexts, at least twice, once in Acts 25 verse 8, and once in Philippians 3, I think verse 5 or 6, he says in Acts 25 verse 8, he says like this: neither against the law of the Jews, or against the Torah of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. And in Philippians it says, according to the righteousness that comes from the Torah, I am blameless. And in the third text in Acts 28:17, when he meets with the leaders of the Jewish community in Rome, he says, I've done nothing against the traditions of our forefathers. All right, either Paul is lying and Christian theologians are telling the truth, or Paul is telling the truth and the Christian theologians are lying. That's the only options that you see. Because I believe Paul is telling the truth. I think that Paul never ate anything unkosher, never broke the Sabbath laws, never desecrated any of the laws of the Torah, as he states very clearly in these texts. Okay, what then happened? There are 2 principles of Torah that seem contradictory, but they're not, and lawyers can understand this. One is that not every law is supremely to be upheld at all cost. There are laws that are more important than other laws. There are laws that are less important, and the more important law always supersedes the less important law. The dietary laws are not the most important laws. The Torah doesn't prescribe punishment, doesn't prescribe fine. There's no need to sacrifice an animal to be atoned from the dietary laws of the Torah. However, offending your fellow man in public, you lose your eternal life, according to the rabbis, according to Jewish tradition of that period. Yeah? You lose your eternal life. So that's why Paul says to the church in Corinth, listen, if you go to somebody's house and he bona fide bought meat sacrificed on idols or a good set of pork chops, if he doesn't say anything to you, shut up, eat and enjoy. You don't die from it. Pork is tasty. I know, I grew up with it. So, however, a person invites you to his house and then you embarrass him on his table, that's a very serious problem. So it's better for you to observe the more serious law and pass on the less serious law. That's okay. That's what Paul was teaching about the dietary laws and about other laws as well. Now, the Jew-Gentile problem in the early church was the major problem. All of Paul's letters deal with that problem. And Paul's solution, both in Ephesians and in Galatians and in Colossians, in Colossians he uses the term one new man. The two, the Jews and the Gentiles, come together under God with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and they become one new man. Now, one new man doesn't mean that each one gives up his identity. It doesn't mean that the men become women and the women become men. That's only true in Washington. It means that each one gives the freedom, the allowance to the other to be who he is without imposing himself and his traditions and his gender and his lifestyle on others. There is freedom in the Torah. That's why we have all kinds of Jews. We have Orthodox Jews, Reformed Jews, conservative Jews, tomato Jews, orange Jews, lemon Jews, all kinds of Jews. And we live together. In Israel, we have black Jews, white Jews, blonde Jews, blue-eyed Jews, Jews that look like Chinese. We have Chinese Jews too. And we have, many different kind of traditions. Yemenite Jews don't pray like Ashkenazi Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews don't pray like Sephardic Jews. We have different prayers, different traditions, and it's okay, we can live together. That's the paradigm that Paul is coming from. He's coming from a very diverse Judaism, of diaspora Judaism of the land of Israel. We have Egyptian Judaism, Philo. We have other kinds of Judaism in Jerusalem, in Israel, like the Essenes and others. We can live together, and we can fight together. We remain brothers, and we fight our enemies side by side, which is shoulder to shoulder with each other. That's something that Christians haven't learned to do yet.
Okay, so in this regard, and I know there is a scholastic debate, as I referenced earlier, on whether or not Paul lived outside of Torah, and you've made clear your concept of that. But we've got passages like the Galatians passage, which is used by folks of the other school, where Paul writes in Galatians 2, "When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him," calling it a hypocritical act, "so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, 'If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?'" So he confronts the problem there. Of course, a big debate over whether that's before or after the Acts 15 Jerusalem conference. Let's set all of that aside for a moment. And the question becomes this: does anybody want to take issue with whether or not Paul may have lived differently around Gentiles than he did around Jews? And was the hypocrisy that he's talking about there, that James in front of Jews would try to force Gentiles to be Jews, but if the Jews aren't there, the Jewish believers, then Peter would just be like the Gentiles himself and find it hunky-dory and enjoy the pork chops. Anybody want to take issue with whether or not Paul kept kosher and kept these rules?
Let me answer you here in a short answer. One is, I ate with the Gentiles today at noon, right? I ate with the Gentiles in Nashville several times. That doesn't mean that I eat something that was not kosher. I can eat with my Gentile brothers, they can eat the pork chops right next to me, and I'll eat fish. It's okay. There's no necessity to say that Paul ate not kosher or broke the law because he ate with the Gentiles. The same with Peter. The sin that Peter was guilty of and that he was afraid of is what's called in Hebrew marit ayin. Marit ayin, it means the sin of how it looks to the eye. When people see an Orthodox Jew sitting with the Gentiles, their assumption is that he's eating what they eat. And that is politically not acceptable. That was Peter's problem. Peter did not understand that the gospel is something that was foreseen by the Torah, by Moses himself, by the prophets, almost all the prophets except Obadiah, and it is brought into reality by Jesus Christ for all the nations. Israel was not designed to be a nation that is sitting alone in the world. It was designed to be a light to the Gentiles. Isaiah says it, in other ways Jeremiah says it, and other prophets have the same concept. A light to the Gentiles, it means that we have to mix with the Gentiles. We have to be influenced on the Gentiles. We have to bring the light that God has revealed to us in Mount Sinai to the world. That's our task. And we can't do it if we are separatist, if we're not integrated, if we are prejudiced, and if we are racist. We can't do it. That was the battle. Peter was more afraid of what people in Jerusalem are going to think than the fellowship that he had with fellow brothers who are believers in Jesus, redeemed by the same blood, in the same faith. That fear is the hypocrisy that Peter had. Now, why does Paul even bring it up? Because he's under attack. Chapter 1 and 2 of Galatians is a very sharp legal lawyer's defense of his right to be an apostle. He was condemned, and his authority as an apostle was questioned. He calls himself an apostle out of season. And so he has, in every one of the letters, he has to defend himself to say, hey, you guys, I am a real apostle. I am not like the other apostles. I'm an apostle out of season. I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, but I'm a real apostle. And my mission is a real mission based on the promises that God gave to Israel to be a light to the nations. We have to be a light to the nations. The prophet said we are. And the only way we can have a light to the nations is to treat our Gentile brothers and sisters without prejudice.
Okay, so in this vein, and I'm coming back to the Gentile end of the table for a moment. In this vein, let me ask it this way. Rabbi Shulam has correctly pointed out that Scripture at the time of Paul's writings is the Old Testament, as we would call it now. And yet, as we've gotten from Dr. Rudolph, there is this Acts 15 conference where there's the Jerusalem gathering of the powers within the church to debate the question of whether or not Gentiles have to become Jews in order to become Christians, in essence. And a letter is written out of that conference. And the conference, before the letter is written, there's this long debate. And you've got the elders debating, and you've got the apostles that are there, you've got the church leadership there. They have a long debate, they study the Scripture, they pray about it, they go back and forth about it, they finally make a decision, and they write the letter. And if you read the letter, it says, it seemed good to us and the Holy Spirit that we should bind on you only the following. Boom, 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 boom. So the church in Jerusalem in the Acts 15 conference seems to be under the understanding that they are writing an opinion of the Holy Spirit, which is one of the references for who was responsible for the Old Testament. Read the writer of Hebrews. Sometimes he'll say, as David said. Other times he'll say the same passage as the Holy Spirit said. So my question to you is, as we pivot a little bit, was Paul aware of the fact that what he was writing to these churches might become Holy Writ, Scripture, at some point? Did he see what he was writing as something more than Paul trying to address the problem of his own apostleship, or trying to address the problem of what happened with Peter, or trying to address the problem of the law and grace? George, Mark, who's going first?
I'll say a couple things. There are some passages in Thessalonians where Paul says, when I was with you, you accepted my teachings as what they are, the Word of God. Now that's technically applying to his oral teaching with the church, not to the letters. But I think it's not hard to think that he might say the same thing about a letter he wrote if he says it about an oral lesson that he gives. So I don't think Paul thought he was writing books of the Bible, but he wrote as one called by God as an apostle to teach through the Spirit what he thought the Christians should do. And the question I have that raises in the Acts 15 is, yes, the Spirit is guiding them to create this letter about what to avoid. And one of the things they are to avoid is meat offered to idols. And I've always read that as being a temporary concession that's going to allow Jews and Gentiles to be in the same church and to eat a fellowship meal together. But I wonder if that's supposed to carry on all the time, given what Paul says later about eating meat offered to idols. So I would wonder if, I'm just curious about that. Is that a temporary thing for Acts, or is that something that's supposed to be all the time?
Well, just my 2 cents on that. It's interesting that actually within church history, for the first 8 centuries, at least of the church, there was a strong sensitivity to not eating food sacrificed to idols. So the Jerusalem Council decision on that issue did seem, at least in the history of the reception, to be something that was viewed to be more permanent. That's one thing. Second, in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, you can read the passage to say Paul's rule is do not eat food sacrificed to idols. But then in the passage that Rabbi Joe pointed out, what he's saying is if you don't know it's food sacrificed to idols, don't be concerned about it. In other words, if you purchase something in the marketplace and it's doubtful, then you have not actually violated that commandment. And even within rabbinic literature, we see a similar kind of halachic debate.
Okay, so do you live by that rule?
I do, in the sense that I will go to a restaurant and I will order foods that are acceptable from a Leviticus 11 standard, but I'm aware that if I'm in a non-kosher restaurant, that it's possible that could be mixed in the kitchen with some other foods that would be forbidden. But I'm not going to ask, did that pot get mixed with some other pot?
Yeah, and you don't have any, do you have an issue with mixing milk and meat, or?
I'll tell you, the principle that I live by is actually the Romans 14 principle that Paul lays out, which is that no food is unclean in itself, or nothing is unclean in and of itself. And I recently actually did an article on this subject of Romans 14 and that principle, and it's interesting. A lot of scholars believe that that's actually a Pharisaic, Hallelite principle, that there's no, in essence, ontologically, from a Pharisaic, Hallelite view, which later became the rabbinic view, that nothing is fundamentally, intrinsically unclean. So as an example, it is a very good example. Passover is coming. Well, one of the commandments one of the mitzvahs that we're given as Jews is you're supposed to clean your house of any kind of chametz, kind of leaven, right? So we do that. We clean our home, and then when you're done, just before Passover with your Bedikat chametz tradition, you're searching for chametz, then you say a traditional blessing, a prayer, which basically says, may any chametz that I'm unaware of be nullified. So the reality, the traditional Jewish understanding is there may be chametz there.
Okay, but
you've done your best.
You didn't answer my question, sorry. Do you mix milk and meat? In other words, will you have a cheeseburger or meat on your pizza?
Depends what do you mean by meat and what do you mean by milk.
Okay, so I was riding on another airplane.
The rabbi's answer.
I was riding on another airplane, and I had a young boy sitting next to me, and he had a yarmulke on, and he had his name, and it was Solomon, written in Hebrew, Shlomo. But I looked at him, and I said, hello, Solomon. And he was a bit taken aback, and he said, are you Jewish? And I said, no, I'm Goy. And he said, how did you know my name? I said, it's written on your hat. And he says, but it's written in Hebrew. I said, I have a degree in Hebrew. He said, you're not Jewish and you have a degree in Hebrew? I said, yes. I said, so tell me about you. And it was his first time to leave New York City, and he had gone to visit a relative in Dallas. And so I was the first Gentile he'd ever really had much of a conversation with. And I started asking him what he learned in Hebrew school and what kind of debates he had with his friends. And he said that there were liberals and conservatives at his school. And I said, tell me about the conservatives. And he said, well, we just had this big debate in class between the liberals and conservatives. I said, tell me about it. Well, the conservatives said, the Jewish kosher rule is you don't mix milk and meat. And the conservatives said, if you're cooking a stew, and you're making the dressing for a salad, and you pour the buttermilk and a drop splashes out of the dressing into the stew, do you have to throw away the entire pot of stew? The conservatives said yes. The liberals said not if there are at least 60 portions of stew for each drop of milk. Then it's sufficiently diluted. So this is where some of this comes in for me. And I'm curious if in the midst of trying to recognize this, at what point do you draw the line and just say, I'm not going to do the obvious things, but I'm just going to leave it alone?
This principle it's called batel b'shishim in Hebrew. Even if a piece of bacon comes into your stew that is less than 1/60th of the volume of the stew, you don't throw the stew. There's only 3 commandments in Judaism that you die for and don't break. One is bowing down and worshiping an idol. Another one is incest in the family. And another one is handing over a fellow human being, not necessarily a Jew, to a condition that you know that he will be harmed. Those are the only 3 commandments. All the other commandments in Judaism are negotiable. It's good for lawyers.
Okay.
You can legally lie. You can, in order to save somebody's life, you can legally lie.
Okay. Now,
you can eat pork if you're hungry.
all right, I got this. I don't want to lose it, but I'm recognizing our time, and I've so saved a chunk of an area to get into, but I don't want to leave this yet. I need my goy at the end of the table here, my goyim. I guess y'all are plural. We're plural. Okay, so would you eat meat sacrificed to an idol? George?
I'm trying to imagine that happening, a situation. Yes.
You would?
Yes.
Would not bother you?
Well, I don't know that it wouldn't bother me. I kind of rest on where Jesus proclaimed all food's clean and what Paul says about...
Well, the food may be clean, but not after you sacrifice it to an idol.
Well, and then what Paul says about, eat.
Okay, fair enough. All right, Mark, come on.
I can talk about this from experience. Because if you live in many cultures in the world, polytheism is a reality, right? This is for hundreds of millions of people today. So you have to work through this kind of question in certain settings. For me, it was a question of I need to interrogate the people I'm with and see how they're going to understand what I was doing. Is my refusal simply a way of humiliating them? Or is it simply or do they understand that, yeah, he's a Christian and this is not, he's not worshiping this deity? For me, it wasn't exactly a meat offered to an idol. It was meat offered to the dead. In many Asian cultures, right? It's customary to feed the dead. So
Would you eat it?
Yes. So because you say to yourself, well, look, I don't know whether the dead eat this food or not. It seems unlikely to me to be the case.
Okay, I may be shifting down to the Jewish end of the table on this one.
Well, look.
I'm waiting. Hold on, Dr. Rudolph. Here's the reason why. So I found myself 18 months ago in Hull, England. And I'm gone to what has become my favorite restaurant in Hull, England. They make a hummus that is so good. It belongs in Israel. They make a shish taouk that's just like so good. And I'm really enjoying this restaurant. And I go over there with my little sister, and she says to me, do you have any problems eating the meat here? Because the meat was was butchered. Let me get the word right. Butchered under Islamic law. Muslim, with a tribute to Allah and the dedication to Allah as the animal is killed. I thought, well, that's just ruined a really good meal for me. A dedication of the animal to Allah as it is killed. Would that bother you as Christian or Jew to eat? In light of Paul. Okay. This is short answer. This is rapid fire.
All right, well, this is just to preface that my wife is Japanese. And so when we went to my in-laws' house after we were married for the first time as a couple, it was during the New Year's period, which is called a Shogatsu in Japan. And my wife grew up Shinto and Buddhist. So in her parents' home, there is a Shinto altar and a Buddhist altar. And there are sacrifices on both in the house. So on New Year's Day, the tradition is to take the sacrifice and to eat that as part of your meal. And so my wife and I, the night before, discussed 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 and really processed this. And we came to the decision. Now this was before I did all my doctoral work and was focusing on this passage, but we came to the decision that if it was on the altar, that Paul drew the line at the altar. If something is on the altar, if it's understood to be sacrificed, then it would be prohibited. So we decided that in the morning we would explain to our parents who are not believers in Yeshua, or not followers of the Messiah, that we would not be eating that portion of the food. Actually, it's mixed in with all the food, so we couldn't eat really anything. And because the rice is on there, and then it's mixed in. And so what happened was, very interesting, we made that decision in the evening. In the morning, Harumi, my wife Harumi's mother, told us at night mice had come in and eaten the food that was on the altar, and so they had to throw it away. So I felt that was God honoring our decision.
I'll tell you, my wife is diabetic and has rheumatoid arthritis for many years. Now, one Orthodox Jew, a rabbi that I studied with in the yeshiva, came and said, listen, there is a rabbi, the chief rabbi of Bombay, India. And he was sick with arthritis for years and years, and he discovered a cure for arthritis. And he's giving it out for free. The medicine he gives out for free. Let's go and get some for your wife. So we went, and we came back with a big plastic bag full of this medicine. The essence of the medicine was ginger powder, dried ginger powder. And you were supposed to take a spoon and put it in your mouth and then drink water very fast because it's very spicy, very hot. So we brought it to my wife, and my wife is also a chemist. I studied chemistry like me. So she decided to analyze this powder, what it is. So she started looking through the powder in a dish, and she found little tiny shrimp in the powder and little pieces of bacon in the powder. Now this is the chief rabbi of Bombay, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi. So my wife refused to eat it, to take it. So I took the bag back, I went back to the rabbi. I said, how could you as a rabbi do this? He said, what do you mean? It's a mitzvah, it's a command. For medicine, you can eat anything. Anything that is not kosher, you could eat for medicine. As long as the portion is less than the size of an olive or the weight of an olive. So Jews are a lot less legalistic than some of our Christian brothers, folks.
All right. Do we want to add anything on this subject before I move us to our last subject?
Well, I question the premise of the question.
Yes.
Because Allah is not a pagan God, right? So the word Allah
That's an issue.
is a Semitic name for God.
Halal is like kosher, not dedicated to Allah or nothing. It means that the animal...
Right.
Halal means that when they slaughter the animal, they check the lungs and the livers and the kidney, and if there is no disease in the animal is halal. There is no blessing, there is no anything, they're not dedicated to anybody except the people who are going to eat it. Just like kosher, there is no dedication to anything. It's halal. Jews are allowed to eat halal. Jews are allowed to eat in a Muslim restaurant more than are allowed to eat in a Christian restaurant.
That's right.
Orthodox Jews.
And it'll be better food
Because there's
too,
no
probably.
pork in a Muslim restaurant.
Not even in the medicine. Okay, George?
I have a question that occurs to me, and it may be occurred to others in the audience as well. What changed for Judaism for Paul, for Peter, when they became believers in Jesus? Because this type of discussion is what raised this question for me. So Peter in Acts 15 says, why are we binding on the Gentiles a yoke which we, something like we cannot bear this. And so when we talk about, I think I'm trying to speak for people in the audience, when we hear about these very technical ways of keeping kosher, that's kind of what we associate as Gentiles with, oh, that's the thing we don't have to worry about anymore because Jesus has come. So I know that because Jesus has come, it changed what Gentiles had to do to become part of children of Abraham. What has changed for what Jews have to do?
Jews were called to be a light to the nations. They closed themselves up. They took a position that is in the Psalms called Am lebadad yishkon, a nation that is dwelling alone, separate from everybody else. That position changed. It changed for three reasons. One is Yeshua's death and the prediction of the end of the temple cult in Jerusalem. There were three people that at the year 30 prophesied the end of the temple cult. Jesus was one of them, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was one of them, and Rabbi Tzadok was one of them. All of them basically said the same thing. So with the end of the temple, which was predicted already long before these three people, before Jesus, by the prophets themselves, there was an end of a culture of a religious concept, everything changed. Nothing remained the same. What God did with Jesus, He preempted the change and prepared He prepared the medicine ahead of the disease in Jesus. That is a big thing. It's a tremendously big thing for Jews. When Jews realize that, it's something that is, I had the rabbi of the neighborhood where our synagogue is in downtown Jerusalem. When he heard that I said Jesus is the most important Jew that ever lived, and he changed the world with the Torah and with the prophets. He changed the world. The rabbi started to cry. Orthodox rabbi, ultra-Orthodox rabbi, started to cry. Because Jews don't realize what we have in our hands and the power that Jesus has as a Jew over the whole world. So, yes, the destruction of the temple changed everything in Judaism. And there are only two people who were able to ride that wave without crushing. And that is the disciples of Jesus and the disciples of Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is modern day Pharisaic Judaism. That changed. It changed everything. When we celebrate Passover, what kind of Passover we're celebrating? It's a mock Passover. When we celebrate Sukkot, it's a mock Sukkot. When we celebrate Shavuot, it's a mock Shavuot. Every Shabbat is a mock Shabbat. We have an empty shell without Jesus. Jesus is the one who puts the kosher in the chicken. And the Christians, especially in some churches, they want to restore the first century church, and that is like trying to make chicken soup without chicken. The Jews in the early church are the chicken. You can't have a New Testament church without Jews.
Okay, so this brings us in, and you may have something to add to this, and we try to finish by 4, but we're going to run over maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Because the one area that I really wanted us to finish with is go back then, and this ties in with what George was asking, well, I think. And George, just by asking, you don't escape answering yourself, okay? Nice try. I'd like to hear each of your sayings or each of your perspectives on this. We'll start with Dr. Rudolph, and then we'll pick back up with Mark, George, and Joe, and just come back around this way. So Joe, you get the last word. Let me phrase the question this way. Some of the most difficult writings of Scripture to understand for many are contained by the Apostle Paul in Romans, where he speaks about the issues of the Gentiles having been grafted into the tree. And he speaks about the tree being one of the children of Abraham. And he speaks of children of Abraham by faith, as well as by what we would call DNA. And in the process, he talks about how there has been, in essence, the Jews, for a time, you're going to see an unbelief of sorts, and then there will be a return. And the chapters are open to so much interpretation and such a mess. I'm sure you've each thought about it. And so I want your perspectives on Romans 9, 10, and 11. And tell us what your thoughts are. I don't know that all of you will agree, and don't know that all of you will care to share your thoughts, recognizing this will be on the internet soon. But with that fair warning and absolutely no preparation at all, tell us, Dr. Rudolph, why don't you start? Tell us about this.
Actually, recently I was writing some things on this subject, and I came up with an acronym. All right, so I'll share with you my acronym on this to try to tease this out. The acronym was Gucci. Gucci as in the purse, or as in Gucci Gucci Goo? As in the purse.
Okay.
So the G stands for the gifts of Israel. The gifts of it. So in Romans 9, it talks about the gifts of Israel in the present tense. That Paul says, these are the gifts that God has given to Israel, and they're in the present tense. The U of Gucci is the uniqueness of Israel. In Romans 9 through 11, he talks about Jews and Gentiles, about circumcised and foreskin, natural branches, wild olive shoots. The nourishing sap of the olive tree is shared between the two. So there's this uniqueness of Israel. And he also talks about first for the Jew, and this sense in which there's value in circumcision, there's advantage in being a Jew, while at the same time he's reminding his primarily Gentile audience that before the throne of God, everyone is a child of God. And then the first C in Gucci, the calling of Israel. He talks about the calling in 1 Corinthians 7, but in Romans 11, verse 29, he says the gifts and the calling of God to Israel are irrevocable. And then in the second C, the confirmation of Israel's promises. Actually, that really moves into Romans 15, but he talks about how the Messiah came to confirm the promises given to Israel. And lastly, the irrevocability of Israel's election. He asks the question, has God rejected his people whom he foreknew? And he says, yes. Is that what he says? No. He says, God forbid. Of course not. May it never be. Me genoita, oi gewalt. And so I think that those emphases, the gifts of Israel, the uniqueness of Israel, the calling of Israel, the confirmation of Israel's promises, and the irrevocability of Israel's election are what he's really trying to hammer across. So while, yes, the majority of the Jewish people who were, the majority of the Jewish leaders and people who were aware of Yeshua in the first century, I'm not sure the majority of the Jewish people were at that point. But those that were, it seemed there was not this mass turning to Yeshua. Despite that, Paul has a hope. He has a future hope, and he has a present hope in the remnant. And so I think Romans 9 through 11, and I would add 15 in there. I think 15 is very important, because he culminates everything by saying, Gentiles rejoice with God's people. In the end, to put it all in a nutshell, Paul is saying God cares about interdependence and mutual blessing, which is my answer to your question. I think what Rabbi Joe said is exactly true, that what has changed is the Messiah is in everything. The Messiah is in every aspect of Torah. The Messiah is in everything related to spiritual life. But another thing that's changed, which is related, is that he's put Jews into this relationship of interdependence and mutual blessing through the new covenant. Because as Rabbi Joe said, after Yeshua came, God's people we were no longer just Jews. God's people now included non-Jews. So that interdependence and mutual blessing, Paul is just hammering again and again in Romans 9 through 11 and 15.
All right. Mark?
I don't have a cool acronym or a luxury good to refer to, but I think, to me, the theology of Romans 9 through 11 is a lot like the theology of the end of the book of Psalms. If you remember the last 5 Psalms, the Psalters deliberately ended with these songs of praise, celebrating the majesty of God and inviting all the universe, the angels, the beasts, even the dragons, the imaginary animals, everything to praise God. And I think that sort of theology seems to be behind a lot of Romans, right? That really what's at stake is, yes, Israel and the Gentiles, but what's at stake is the trustworthiness of God, and whether God is a God who keeps promises or not, and whether human ungodliness is enough to cancel out the work of God. Its ungodliness is, and the answer is no, that what makes the human race godly is the presence of God, not their actions. And so I think that, yes, I agree with everything you said, but and I would add also that the key here, I think, is who is God in this picture. So,
George.
I would say that Romans 9 through 11, though difficult, is a really key to understanding Romans, because for a long time, like a good evangelical Protestant, I read Romans as being about my personal salvation. I'm not saved by the good things that I do. I'm saved through faith in Christ. But Romans 9 through 11 really, if that's your reading of Romans, then that doesn't really belong in there. So trying to fit that in broadens the gospel to, it's the justification through the faithfulness of Jesus is about Jew and Gentile being able to eat together, to live together. So it's a bigger gospel than just my personal sin problem. It really puts the whole Bible together in a beautiful way. I mean, it's how God, through Jesus, has been able to bring Jew and Gentile together. And if Paul saw that if you could bring Jew and Gentile together, you can bring anybody together. And so I think that's the important part about Romans 9 through 11.
Rabbi Joe?
Mark, I'm going to do three things. One is I'm going to give you 2 tips to understand the Apostle Paul's letters and the Apostle Paul himself. They're simple. The first tip, Paul is a lawyer and he writes like a lawyer, which means that his writings are difficult to understand. I didn't say that. The Apostle Peter said that in 2 Peter 14 through 17. They're difficult to understand, and Paul is very consistent. He's consistent in everything. One of the things that is consistent that you ought to take into account is his use of the pronouns. I don't have time now to give you a whole lecture on this, but here is the key. A pronoun you, third person pronoun or second person pronoun is always talking about the Gentiles. You Gentiles, you were dead in your trespasses, you were without God. You always the Gentiles. We, us and ours, it's always about the Jewish disciples of Jesus. So the first person plural pronouns is always about the Jewish disciples of Jesus. You is always about the Gentile disciples of Jesus. Simple. The second thing, because he was a lawyer, the prepositions are the vehicles, they are the wheels on which his logic is traveling. Therefore, and other prepositions that he uses, they are the wheels of the logic. You cannot escape them. Thing like thus, or for this reason, or because, all these are prepositions that carry the logic of his argument. And some of these prepositions, like shall we say then, he is going to raise a straw man in order to knock him down. The problem with Luther and Calvin and a lot of the reformers is that they caught on to the straw man that Paul raised and missed the argument. Pay attention to the prepositions and to the pronouns. That's the first thing I want to tell you. The second thing is, one of my friends in the Hebrew University, Paula Fredrickson. You heard of her? Yeah. She was in the University of Boston for 7 years, and now she's in Jerusalem. Paula Fredrickson says, Paul is the greatest Judaizer of them all. Why? Because Paul's goal, like the goal of all the prophets, is in the final account to have one synagogue. My house will be a house of prayer for all the nations. That is the vision that Isaiah had, and that is the vision that oils Paul's life mission. That's what gives him the courage and the strength to sacrifice his position in the high court in Jerusalem, to sacrifice his family, he had a family, and to sacrifice his honor as a great lawyer in Jerusalem. to become a wandering Jew. Because he saw this great mission that the prophets are seeing, that one day there will be a house of God, not a mosque and not a church, but a house of God for all the nations, each with his distinction. The Korean brothers will remain with the Korean face, the Americans will remain with the pale face, our African brothers will be black, the Jews will be Jews, the Arabs will be Arabs, there will be one and the one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's Paul's vision, and that's where he gets his inspiration and his strength to bear the lashes, to bear the shipwrecks, to bear the jail that he had to bear. The third point is, the only way that Paul could do it, is to be firm in the knowledge of who he is, who his people are, and where he really belongs. And he makes that very clear in Acts 21, and from Acts 21 to Acts 28. In all his witnesses before Agrippa and Festus and the Sanhedrin and other places where he gave his defenses, you read his defenses, you'll understand. Paul never left his Jewish identity. He never became anything else except a Jew. And if I ask most pastors how many times does the word Christian appear in the New Testament, most of them wouldn't know the answer. How many times? Who knows? Besides Scott and Mark. Mark Lanier says 1.
3.
3. Yeah. 3 times. But most people don't know. They know 1 time. It's in Acts 11:26. It's in Acts 26. It's in 1 Peter 4:16. That's all. But not at 1 time do the Christians call themselves Christians. Others call them Christians. It was a derogatory term. The word Messianic in Hebrew and the word Christian in Greek are the same words. Christian is a translation of Messianic. So why are we calling ourselves Messianic and not Christian? Because Christianity has one ugly history. Crusades, Inquisitions, Holocaust, and I could go on and on and on. And we just all of us are old enough to remember that just recently a 40-year-old war ended in Ireland between Christians and Christians. So that's why we as Jews prefer to use the Hebrew instead of the Greek. But we still accept you as our brothers. We don't want to circumcise you. You can relax. Go home in peace.
Okay, so in closing, I left out one of my big subject areas, but you brought it up with the counting. Your quiz. What is the term that Paul uses for the church that no other writer does?
The way.
Paul is the only one to call the church the body of Christ. The only one. So for him, that one church, the house of prayer, is the one body of Christ. And we are all made up of the one body. And to have division in the church is the idea of dividing up a body, and it makes no sense. Would you all join me in thanking our panel?